The hangar was freezing, but the air in the briefing room felt like it was burning. 32 of the most decorated pilots in the United States Air Force stood in absolute, suffocating silence, their eyes locked on a single manila folder resting on the steel table. For months they had mocked her. They called her the Cornfield Pilot, a small-town girl who supposedly learned to fly in a crop duster and didn't belong in a cockpit worth $80 million. They had laughed when she walked into the room, tossing her flight suit aside like she was just another recruit. But then, the general opened the file. 1 page. That was all it took. As he read the classified history behind her seemingly ordinary life, the condescending smirks vanished, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror. Nobody breathed, nobody moved, because the woman standing in front of them wasn't a rookie. She was a ghost, the only person alive who had actually survived what they were about to be sent into. And as she looked up, her eyes didn't show fear, they showed pity. I remember the day I walked onto the base at Nellis. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the desert air feels like sandpaper against your skin. I wasn't supposed to be there, and truthfully, I didn't want to be. I was just a girl from a dead-end town in Nebraska, where the biggest thrill was watching the dust devils dance across the cornfields at dusk. I had learned to fly in an old rattletrap Cessna that smelled like rusted oil and broken dreams, taught by a father who believed the sky was the only place where you couldn't be controlled. When I stepped into the mess hall, the atmosphere shifted instantly. You know that feeling, when the conversation dies, not because you've interrupted, but because you've become the subject of a very specific, very cruel joke. I heard them whispering, "Cornfield Pilot," they snickered, loud enough for me to catch every syllable. To them, I was a walking insult to the prestige of the program. They were top guns, sons of admirals, graduates of elite academies who had lived their entire lives in the crosshairs of ambition. I was just someone who knew how to read the wind by the way the stocks leaned. I took my tray and sat at the farthest end of the room, staring at a stain on the table. I kept my head down, not because I was intimidated, but because I knew something they didn't. I knew what the ceiling really felt like when you pushed a machine past the point of mechanical sanity. I knew the sound of metal screaming under G-force, a sound that once heard, you never truly get out of your dreams. But I kept my mouth shut. My father always told me that if you reveal your cards before the game starts, you're already losing. So I played the part. I tripped over a chair during the initial flight simulation, earning a roar of laughter from a pilot named Miller, a man whose ego was only rivaled by his arrogance. He walked up to me, his wings gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, and leaned in close enough for me to smell his stale coffee breath. "Look, sweetheart," he whispered, "this isn't a tractor you're handling here. Why don't you do us all a favor and resign before you kill someone?" I didn't answer him. I just looked through him. I saw the way his hand shook ever so slightly when he thought no one was looking, the telltale sign of a man who had seen a close call and was desperate to bury the memory. He was terrified, and he was taking it out on me because I was the easiest target in the room. That night, the tension reached a breaking point. We were called into the main briefing room for an emergency session. Rumors had been swirling all day about a new classified operation. Some said it was a training exercise, others said it was something much darker, involving deep-range reconnaissance into restricted airspace. When I walked in, the room was already packed. The high-ranking officers stood at the front, their faces grim, their folders thick with black redacted lines. General Holloway stood at the center. He didn't look like a man who was about to give a lecture. He looked like a man delivering a eulogy. He didn't acknowledge anyone as he walked in. He just slammed the file down on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot, silencing the room instantly. "We've been monitoring an anomaly," he began, his voice raspy and devoid of its usual command tone. "Something that doesn't show up on conventional radar, but has been pulling our assets from the sky for the last 6 months. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning every face, eventually landing on me. There was a flicker of something in his expression. Regret? No, it was something colder. Acknowledgement. He reached for the folder, his fingers trembling just a fraction. We thought we were dealing with standard hostile interception. We were wrong. We've been chasing a ghost, and the only reason we have any data at all is because one individual, at great personal risk, actually engaged this target and lived to tell the tale. Miller sat up straighter, looking expectant, probably waiting for his name to be called. He adjusted his collar, looking around with a smirk that said, "Finally, they're recognizing my talent." But the general didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at any of the decorated veterans. He reached into the folder, pulled out a grainy black-and-white photograph, and laid it on the table. The room collectively gasped. It was a photo of a cockpit, mangled beyond recognition, the instrument panel fused into an unrecognizable hunk of glass and wire. It was the wreckage of a plane that should have turned its pilot into vapor. Miller's face went pale. He leaned forward, squinting at the image, his voice barely a tremor when he finally spoke. "Sir, that's impossible. Nobody survives that kind of kinetic impact. Whoever was in that bird is dead." The general finally turned, his gaze locking onto mine with the weight of 1,000 secrets. "That's what the report says, Major," he replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "But the report is wrong. The pilot who walked away from that wreckage is in this room right now." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like the pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Heads turned, slowly, as if moving underwater. They weren't looking at the heroes anymore. They were looking at me. And for the first time, I felt the cold, hard reality of my situation. I had spent years running from the past, trying to hide the truth behind a mask of indifference, but the secret was out. And the look in their eyes, that sudden shift from arrogance to sheer, unadulterated dread, told me that the game had changed. They weren't laughing anymore. They were terrified, and they were about to find out exactly why. The air in the room didn't just stand still. It felt like it had been vacuum sealed. Miller was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, the smirk he'd worn just minutes ago replaced by a profound, hollow confusion. He looked at the photograph of the mangled cockpit, then back at me, searching for a trace of the woman he'd been mocking all day. He couldn't find her, because in that moment, the Cornfield Pilot wasn't there. General Holloway didn't give anyone a chance to process the revelation. He flipped to the next page in the file, revealing a flight log dated 3 years ago. The ink was faded, marked with official stamps that looked like they belonged to a Black Ops clearance level I wasn't supposed to have access to. 3 years ago, the general said, his voice echoing against the bare walls. An experimental long-range interceptor went dark over the North Atlantic. It wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't supposed to exist. It was a prototype designed to test the limits of human endurance under extreme gravitational stress. The mission was classified as a failure. Total loss of pilot and aircraft. We buried the incident. We erased the records. He took a step toward me, but he didn't look at me like an officer looks at a subordinate. He looked at me with a weary, almost reverent curiosity. "We were wrong about the total loss part. The pilot didn't go down with the bird. She brought it back, or at least what was left of it." My heartbeat was steady, a rhythm I'd practiced to keep hidden during the most dangerous moments of my life. I didn't look at the other pilots. I didn't need to see the way their faces were contorting, the way their pride was turning into something much more dangerous: resentment. They were the best the military had to offer, yet they were being outclassed by a ghost they hadn't even bothered to learn the name of. "Why is she here, General?" Miller's voice cut through the silence. It was sharp, defensive, and desperate. "If she's some kind of miracle pilot, why are we wasting time with her in basic integration? Why are we playing games in the simulators?" The general turned to look at Miller, his expression hardening. "Because, Major, you aren't here to train for the future. You're here because we're going back to where that plane disappeared, and the only person who knows what's waiting in that sector, the only person who has actually looked into the eyes of the thing that took our aircraft down, is sitting right there." He pointed directly at me. The room felt like it was shrinking. I finally stood up. My chair scraped against the concrete floor, a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. I walked toward the front of the room, my boots echoing with a steady, military precision that clearly unsettled them. They were expecting a crop duster girl to stutter, to hide, to be intimidated by the sheer weight of their collective experience. I stopped beside the general and looked at the photo of the wreckage. I didn't see a twisted pile of metal. I saw a map. I saw the trajectory of the crash, the point of impact, and the exact moment the horizon had tilted and refused to come back up. "It wasn't an engine failure," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and completely devoid of the shaky nerves they expected. "And it wasn't a freak storm. If you go back there, you aren't going to be fighting another pilot. You're going to be fighting the physics of the sky itself." I could see the skepticism flaring in their eyes. They wanted to believe I was a fraud, a plant, or just a delusional recruit. But then I reached out and touched the photograph. I traced the line of the fuselage where it had been torn open, not by force, but by something that looked like cauterization. "You think your flight suits will protect you," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "You think your training, your maneuvers, and your lock-on systems will give you an advantage. But out there, at 60,000 feet, where the air is thinned and the silence is absolute, none of that matters. The thing that hit me didn't care about my call sign. It didn't care about my flight hours. It just deleted us." I turned back to the general. "You want them to fly into that sector? Fine, but don't tell them they're going on a mission. Tell them they're going on a retrieval. Because if they think they're going to win a dogfight, they're already dead." The air in the room shifted again. It wasn't fear anymore. It was cold, hard, and sharp. Miller stood up, his chair clattering backward. He walked toward me, stopping just inches away. He was taller, broader, and clearly itching to assert his dominance one last time. "You've got a lot of nerve," he hissed, his face tight with anger. "Acting like you're some kind of expert just because you survived one bad day. You think you're special? You think we need your help?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "I don't care what the general says. You're a ghost, fine. But out there, in the air, I'm the one who decides who lives and who dies, and I don't follow the lead of a pilot who spends her time reading manuals in the dark." I didn't flinch. I just stared into his eyes, and for a second I let him see it. I let him see the flicker of the memory, the burning blue light, the feeling of the plane being ripped apart at the seams, the way the world turned into a kaleidoscope of glass and fire. He recoiled, as if I'd physically struck him. "You think you're the pilot, Miller?" I asked, my voice barely audible but carrying throughout the silent room. "You have no idea what it feels like when the sky decides it's done with you." Before he could respond, the alarm system in the hangar began to blare, a low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the floorboards. The lights in the briefing room flickered, then dimmed to a deep, ominous red. The general looked at his tablet, his face going pale. "It's not a drill," he whispered, looking toward the ceiling as if he could see through the concrete to the sky above. "The anomaly, it's moved." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "It's not in the Atlantic anymore. It's right above us." The red emergency lights pulsed with the heavy, rhythmic thumping that seemed to be shaking the very foundation of the base. It wasn't the sound of an engine, and it wasn't the sonic boom of a jet breaking the barrier. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated in your teeth, a sound that felt less like noise and more like a physical pressure against your eardrums. Outside, the sky, which had been clear and bright just an hour ago, had turned an unnatural, bruised shade of violet. Miller stumbled back, clutching his head, his bravado instantly shattered by the sheer sensory overload. The other pilots were in disarray, scrambling toward the windows, their training overriding their fear for a brief second. They saw it. A massive, silent silhouette hovering directly above the restricted flight line. It wasn't a plane. It didn't have wings. It didn't have engines, and it defied every aerodynamic principle they had ever been taught. It just existed, hanging there like a tear in the fabric of reality. "Get them to the tarmac, now!" the general screamed, his command voice barely cutting through the oppressive hum. "This is not a drill. Every available bird, get in the air. We need a perimeter." But nobody moved. They were frozen, staring at the screen where the radar was doing something impossible. It was spinning wildly, unable to lock on to a target, because the target wasn't just in the sky. It was overlapping with the base's own signature. I didn't look at the screen. I didn't need to. I walked toward the heavy blast doors, my mind flashing back to that day 3 years ago, the day my life as a Cornfield pilot ended and my life as an Anomaly began. I could feel it. The humming wasn't just sound, it was a signal. It was searching. It was looking for the prototype it had left behind, the fragments of the alloy I had dragged home in my own flight suit. I reached into the hidden compartment of my jacket and touched the small, cold piece of alloy I had kept for all these years. It started to vibrate against my skin, pulsing with the same rhythm as the sky above. "It's not here for the base," I said, my voice cutting through the panic like a knife. The room went dead silent. Everyone turned toward me, their faces illuminated by the frantic red strobe of the emergency lights. "It's not a weapon, and it's not an invasion. It's a recovery unit, and it's looking for the piece of it that I didn't leave behind." Miller turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and terror. "You brought that thing to us? You let them track you here?" "I didn't bring it," I snapped, walking toward him, forcing him to take a step back. "I survived it. And if we don't get those planes moving right now, it's not going to just take the piece, it's going to take everything within a 5-mile radius just to be sure it has what it wants." The general stepped between us, his face a mask of iron resolve. "Major, you heard her. Get to your jet. Everyone else, follow her lead. She knows the signature, she knows how it moves. If she says we fly, we fly." I didn't wait for them to argue. I sprinted toward the hangar, the smell of ozone already thick in the air. The base was in total chaos. Ground crews were running, fuel hoses were dragging across the concrete, and the sound of jet engines igniting created a wall of noise that barely muffled the humming from above. I vaulted into the cockpit of the nearest interceptor, my hands moving with a muscle memory I hadn't tapped into for years. As the canopy hissed shut, sealing me into my own private world, the connection solidified. The piece of alloy in my pocket hummed with an intense, freezing cold. I didn't need a flight manual, I didn't need a briefing. I closed my eyes, and I could see the sky not as a map, but as a series of magnetic currents. The tower was screaming orders, but I silenced the comms. I pushed the throttle forward, feeling the massive surge of power beneath me. The jet roared to life, but as I taxied onto the runway, the world outside began to distort. The hangar walls seemed to stretch, the asphalt of the runway rippled like water, and the violet light from above bled down onto the ground. I reached the end of the runway and didn't wait for clearance. I slammed the afterburners into full force. The G-force hit me like a physical weight, pressing me deep into the seat, but I welcomed it. I was going up to meet it. As I punched through the cloud layer, the sight hit me like a blow to the chest. The Anomaly wasn't just a ship, it was an opening, a gateway of swirling, razor-sharp light that was tearing the clouds apart. And circling it, like vultures around a kill, were the interceptors Miller and the others had launched. They were flying blind, their instruments clearly failing, their planes banking erratically as the magnetic field scrambled their flight computers. I saw Miller's jet stall, his engines flame out as the Anomaly pulsed. He was plummeting, heading straight for the ground in a spin he couldn't recover from. He was screaming into the comms, a raw, terrified sound of a man who realized he was no longer the apex predator. I banked hard, ignoring the warnings screaming on my own dashboard. I didn't need the computer to tell me I was going too fast or pulling too many Gs. I was one with the machine, and I was going to pull him out of the fire. But as I dove toward him, the anomaly pulsed again, this time turning a blinding, absolute white. The sound stopped. The world vanished, and for a split second, I wasn't in the jet anymore. I was inside the light, looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that was looking back at me with a terrifying, ancient intelligence. And then, I felt the lock on, not from a missile, but from the entity itself. It had found what it was looking for, and it was going to take it whether I was attached to it or not. The world didn't just go dark, it inverted. My cockpit became a kaleidoscope of static, the glass around me vibrating with a frequency that threatened to shatter it into diamond dust. I was locked in a dive, screaming toward the Earth at Mach 1.2, but the sensation of speed had vanished. I was frozen in a temporal pocket, suspended in the eye of an artificial hurricane. Below me, Miller's jet was a smoking wreck, his ejection seat fire flickering like a dying matchstick against the black desert floor. I didn't think, I reacted. I clawed at the flight stick, feeling the metal bite into my palms as I engaged the manual override, a mechanical bypass that hadn't been touched in decades. The jet groaned, a structural shriek of tortured titanium, but it responded. I banked into a vertical climb, aiming not for the horizon, but for the heart of that blinding white aperture. The entity felt my intent. I could sense its curiosity. It wasn't an enemy, it was a collector, and I was holding the missing piece of its anatomy. The cold in my pocket intensified, turning into a searing supernatural heat that burned through my flight suit and pressed against my hip. I realized then that the alloy wasn't just a part of the ship, it was a beacon, a homing device that had been tethered to my soul since that day 3 years ago. "You want it?" I screamed into the empty air, my voice cracking under the pressure. "Then take it!" I ripped the piece of alloy from my jacket and jammed it into the navigation port of the jet's console. The effect was instantaneous. My entire cockpit erupted in a blinding violet discharge. The jet surged forward with a power that wasn't derived from fuel. It was being pulled, magnetized into the gaping maw of the anomaly. I hit the threshold. The transition wasn't a physical movement, it was a restructuring of reality. The sound of the jet engine vanished, replaced by a deafening, choir-like harmony that resonated deep within my bones. I wasn't flying anymore. I was drifting through a space that defied geography. I looked out the canopy, but there was no sky, no stars, no clouds. There was only an endless, shimmering expanse of data flowing around me like golden rivers of light. I saw the truth. The Cornfield Pilot wasn't a nickname, it was a cover, a carefully constructed illusion by a government that had no idea how to explain what I had become. They hadn't saved me, they had quarantined me. I was the bridge between human limitations and a technology that could fold space like paper. Suddenly, the data streams coalesced, forming the shape of a massive, monolithic structure, the original source of the signal. It was hovering in this void, a city of shifting geometry, its surface constantly folding and unfolding. And there, floating in the center of it, was the twin to the piece I had just sacrificed. I felt the connection snap into place. My jet didn't need to fly, it was being pulled toward the core. I saw other ships there, dozens of them, from different eras, different designs, all of them caught in the same collection net. They were husks, stripped of their purpose, their pilots long gone, their stories erased by the silence of the void. I was drifting toward the center, my heart hammering against my ribs, when a voice, not heard but felt, exploded in my mind. It wasn't a language, it was a sequence of pure emotion, a question regarding the nature of endurance. Why did I survive? Why did I keep fighting for a world that treated me like a secret to be buried? I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but they were steady enough to hold the stick. I realized then that if I let myself be taken, I would become just another ghost in their collection. I would be a monument to a failure. "I'm not a ghost," I whispered, the words echoing in the void. "And I'm not a souvenir." I slammed my fist against the emergency eject, not for the seat, but for the power coupling of the jet's reactor. I was going to turn my aircraft into a supernova. I was going to give them a reason to let me go. I pulled the lever, and for one brief, brilliant moment, the void ignited. The violet light was eclipsed by a blast of pure, incandescent fire that tore through the fabric of their sanctuary. The shock wave threw me back toward the threshold. I felt the gut-wrenching pull of gravity reclaiming me, the violent drag of the atmosphere as I tumbled back into the real world. My jet was disintegrating around me, pieces of the fuselage peeling away like dead skin. I was falling, trailing fire and smoke, hurtling toward the desert floor at a speed that meant certain death. But as I looked up, through the swirling clouds and the fading violet glow, I didn't see the base. I saw the empty, silent expanse of the Nebraska cornfield where I had first learned to fly. I closed my eyes, and for a split second, I wasn't a soldier or a test pilot. I was just a girl in a Cessna, watching the wind move the stalks. And as the ground rushed up to meet me, I didn't feel fear. I felt the sky. The impact wasn't a crash. It was an awakening. When my eyes snapped open, the roar of the desert wind was replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy. I wasn't in a burning cockpit, and I wasn't being incinerated by a runaway reactor. I was lying in the dirt, breathing in the scent of dry earth and dying crops. The Nebraska sun was beating down on my face with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. I sat up, my body aching as if every bone had been reset. My flight suit was shredded, covered in a fine metallic dust that shimmered like crushed diamonds. I looked around. The horizon was empty. The high-tech interceptor, the Anomaly, the General, Miller. It all felt like a fever dream, a hallucination born from too much oxygen deprivation at extreme altitudes. But then I looked at my hands. They were stained with the same violet residue that had been leaking from the Aperture. I stood up, my legs trembling, and scanned the field. There was no wreckage, no fire, just the endless rows of corn stretching out toward the horizon like a green sea under the relentless summer heat. Had I died? Was this some kind of afterlife where the sky finally granted me the peace I'd been hunting for? I started walking. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet moved with a purpose that felt dictated by something buried deep in my nervous system. I walked for hours, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in colors that shouldn't have existed, the same unnatural bruised violet I had seen at the base. I reached the old farmhouse where I'd grown up. It was exactly as I'd left it, paint peeling, porch sagging, the rusted Cessna still sitting in the weeds behind the barn. I walked toward it, my boots crunching on the dry stalks. I reached the cockpit and placed my hand on the metal. The vibration returned instantly. It wasn't a memory. The ship was still with me, not physically, but frequency-wise. I had become the beacon. Every time I touched something, the reality around it bent. I looked at the old Cessna, and for a heartbeat, it turned into the sleek, terrifying prototype I had piloted into the void. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. A sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic hum, the same sound that had heralded the Anomaly back at the base. I turned, and standing at the edge of the field were two men in dark, unmarked suits. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like shadows. "You shouldn't have come back, Lieutenant." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like a machine trying to mimic human speech. "I didn't have a choice," I replied, my voice steady, feeling a power rising within me that made the air around my fingertips crackle with static. It followed me, or maybe I'm the one who called it home. The man stepped forward, reaching into his jacket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a device that glowed with a faint, pulsing blue light, the same light I had seen at the heart of the anomaly. We spent years trying to scrub your record, trying to bury the Cornfield Pilot, because the public isn't ready for what you represent. You are a biological interface for technology that predates human civilization. You think you're a pilot? You're a key. A key to what? I asked, taking a step toward him. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, the stalks of corn bowing as if caught in a sudden localized wind. To the door that never closes, he whispered. Suddenly, the sky above the farmhouse began to tear open again. The violet light flooded the field, and I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline-fueled clarity that they weren't here to capture me. They were here to watch me ascend. They had been waiting for the beacon to reach critical mass, and I was the one who had finally triggered the final sequence. I looked at the men, then at the sky, and then at the rusted Cessna. I realized I didn't need a cockpit to fly anymore. I didn't need fuel, and I didn't need a runway. I looked at the shadow men, and for the first time, I smiled. "You want the truth?" I asked, my voice rising until it sounded like thunder rolling across the plains. "Then watch." I didn't move my arms. I didn't take a breath. I simply willed the sky to recognize me. The world exploded in a kaleidoscope of light. I rose into the air, not in a jet, but in a pillar of pure white energy, tearing through the atmosphere as the farmhouse, the fields, and the two men were left behind in a wake of blinding, deafening silence. I was going back to the void, but this time I wasn't a victim. I was the one holding the controls. I was no longer tethered by gravity, by iron, or by the laws that governed men who measured life in hours and fuel capacity. As I ascended, I saw the world below shrinking into a marble of blue and gray, but it didn't look fragile. It looked like a puzzle, one I finally understood how to solve. The void, that infinite expanse of shifting geometry, welcomed me back. This time there were no cold mechanical locks on my ship. The architecture of the entity bent to my will, the golden rivers of data parting as I moved through them with the grace of a storm. I reached the heart of their sanctuary, that monolithic core that had tried to claim me. It pulsed with a rhythmic, questioning light, a silent demand for my submission. But I didn't submit. I projected the truth of who I was, not as a captured pilot, but as a bridge. I showed it the cornfields of Nebraska, the smell of rain on dry dust, the feeling of a father's hand on a propeller, and the relentless, stubborn defiance of a human spirit that refuses to be erased. The structure shuddered. The geometry collapsed and reformed, sensing the invasion of a will it couldn't calculate. It had been looking for a vessel, but it had found a storm. I felt the connection snap outward, a shockwave of information traveling across the stars, through the folds of space, and back down to the small, dark room at the military base where this nightmare had begun. In that briefing room, thousands of miles and light years away, the file on the table didn't just sit there. It burst into light, the redacted ink dissolving to reveal not secrets of war, but blueprints of existence. I saw the general, I saw Miller, and I saw the thousands of pilots like them, suddenly looking up at a sky that had finally opened its eyes. I wasn't just coming back, I was bringing the horizon with me. I turned the ship, feeling the massive engines of the Anomaly roar in response to my command. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was the navigator of a new reality. I dove back through the aperture, the violet light trailing behind me like a comet's tail, descending toward the world that had tried to silence me. When I broke the atmosphere, I didn't land. I hovered over the base, a beacon of impossible, burning light that erased the shadow of the night. The base went silent. The pilots, the soldiers, the engineers, they all stood frozen on the tarmac, looking up at the sky, seeing the truth that had been hidden from them for decades. I was the Cornfield Pilot, yes, but I was also the one who had walked through the fire and learned that the sky wasn't a ceiling, it was an invitation. I descended, the air around me crackling with the static of 1,000 realities colliding, and as I touched down, the silence was finally broken. It wasn't by orders or alarms, it was by the sound of humanity finally realizing it wasn't alone. The file is open now, and the room isn't silent anymore. It's waiting. If you've ever looked up at the stars and felt that tug in your chest, that strange, quiet knowing that there's something out there waiting to be found, then you know exactly why I didn't stay in the dark. This story, the story of the girl who flew until the sky gave way, isn't just a record of a mission, it's a message. We spend our whole lives building walls, measuring distance, and fearing the unknown. But the truth is, we are meant to cross that line. If you felt the weight of that silence, if you felt the shift when the truth was finally revealed, then you are already part of this flight. Don't let them close the file again. Hit that like button if you're ready to see what's beyond the next horizon, and subscribe to join the crew, because we're just getting started. Drop a comment below. If you were given the keys to the sky, where would you go first? Let's keep this conversation alive, because the room is no longer silent, and I'm waiting to hear from you.